So the great opportunities that this huge disruption have unearthed are really trends that were underway. It's really just pushing certain trends further. The obvious one being mobility and the center of the home being more and more the center of all activity, not just living, raising children and so forth, but also obviously for work and for commerce. Then there's the mess with the healthcare system, and that, of course, throughout all of COVID, we kept coming back to that. Something has got to change. The healthcare system is broken beyond belief, and people know that, but the politics in Washington have precluded doing anything major beyond the Obama Act, which was great, but we're not there yet. Real estate, how we conceive of workplaces, all that commercial space that may not be needed anymore. I was talking to someone the other day about malls, anchor tenants such as Sears and Nordstrom's, Macy's are all closing stores. That means that your anchor tenants at a mall, which is what makes the mall viable because of the amount of space and the customers it attracts. If they're not there, what happens to malls? I said it could be great retirement communities. First floor, you got all your shops, and on the second floor, you have luxury or nice condos. And
that is a great idea.
The weather is always very good, but that's going to be a significant transformation as an example. But real estate, the whole concept of real estate is changing because the home being now more of a center. Do we need all that space? Companies are discovering ways to do hoteling, which we've been doing in consulting for quite a while. But now companies are adopting that. Telecommunication, working at home is becoming, as we said, the last 3 months, everybody's gotten better at it. What is the commercial space in the future going to look like? What does this mean for a city like New York City, which is very, very commercial, but manufacturing's gone. Now a lot of the services could be done from home or not in a space. So these are all trends that were underway that COVID and other disruptions have really just pushed in the immediacy of the changes that have to happen. Interestingly enough, the financial system, which was broken in 2008 and was highly disrupted then, and as a form of disruption became more regulated as it should be, it's actually pretty sound. It's amazing how the stock market, the stock market has rebounded. So it just goes to prove once an industry or a company, or whatever entity is disrupted, and you have to focus on fixing the problems. Usually that transformation is sustainable. And that's the great hope I have for this major disruption, is that the transformation will touch many, many areas that were dysfunctional or currently are still, or needed change. And that, keep your fingers crossed, the great transformation will start when, well, it's already sort of starting in some cases, but will begin to gain in velocity in the years to come.
So you said a lot of interesting things there, but one of them was how, these trends were already on the way. Like you said, I mean, we always see these patterns. You can start to see it. Stores were closing before this, but I think it almost was like that catalyst that they was like, well, why wait? You can move a store, e-commerce store online so much more affordable for them to be carrying these big buildings like, Nordstrom and some of the ones that you mentioned. And we've been watching them for years. But I think you're right. It's going to kind of change even the landscape of when you're driving in your car, what you're seeing and how people are just operating. But
or even whether you're driving that car.
Yeah, I think, and that's where I think Uber's going to pivot to kind of stay in the game, is to maybe self-driving cars. And then again, that the spill off of that changes a whole bunch of other dynamics. But most interesting, I keep going back to, like, I do better working at home because if I'm distracted, then it takes me a while to kind of get back in the groove of what I was doing. So I find that I'm much more productive when I work at home. And I've heard a lot of other people say it, and I've seen it on the news. The IRS reported like a higher production rate. So, there it is. The data is there saying that people are being more productive. There's not as much time wasted. But I just keep thinking that with that lack of human connection, that creativity or that brainstorming, you use that technique a lot with your clients. I mean, that's got to suffer a little bit.
Yeah, well, there's something that I always refer to as the serendipity of business. In other words, the opportunity that comes about by chance meeting or something that's being discussed, someone
Right.
overhears it, and suddenly something goes click. And it can be as small as a coding issue or a product feature, but it can be huge. It could be, the idea. And that really, the big idea, that really comes from human interaction face to face. It certainly can happen virtually. It happens a lot by reading and watching the news and other things, listening to podcasts. But really, the moments that are true ahas and result in a positive change, transformation, do tend to come from encounters, and often it's random. And I've heard people say literally they found their business by accident, by
Right.
sitting next to somebody in an airplane and they started talking. So that's the part that suffers a little bit. But productivity is always good. It's easy to measure. Wall Street reacts favorably to it. But the innovation part is just as important.
Right. So AI, we're looking at a big, once
Mhm.
again, if the execution is something that people stumble on, this kind of pushed them up to that starting line, or at least over that starting line, maybe before they were ready. But I think the changes are going to be radical. I don't think they're all. I don't think they're all bad. I think it's good, but like I said, it's hard to picture what that world would look like. When you look at the
Mhm.
patterns of history, like we've kind of been down this before, not this specifically, but we've been through those times where something new will come in and people say, oh, that'll never stick, or that won't work. And then it becomes such an ingrained part of our life, we forget when it was a new
Right.
technology or a new thing. We adapt it, we absorb it, and here we go again. So
Yeah.
what do you see that is working? Are there any industries that aren't really being touched?
Well, actually, you brought up, I guess, inadvertently, something I wanted to say, which is we think of disruption as a trend. It's only that the word has now become part of our vernacular, or it already was, but it's used now to mean something very specific. Quite honestly, disruption has been a major part of the human experience since we became humans.
Yeah.
It is the one thing that we can do that no other species on the planet can do, which is to confront something and say, this isn't working anymore. This, for one reason or the other, the products are too expensive, or enough people are not, don't have access to certain kinds of healthcare, for example,
Right.
um, from the very beginning. And that's one reason why you and I are sitting here, what is it, 200 miles apart, talking online, seeing each other, having a conversation. That was all because of thousands of big and small disruptions along the way. The printing press was a major disruption.
Right.
The assembly line of Henry Ford, even McDonald's was a major disruptor because it allowed, on the negative side, to put a lot of hamburger joints out of business, rightly so. They were sort of very uncleanly. They often didn't make much money. Transformation is he allowed a lot of those hamburger purveyors, restaurants, to become franchisors of the no franchisee of McDonald's, and many of them became millionaires. So in every case, there's something that was not part of the human, it was not a good part of the human experience, or was could have been better, that gets disrupted, changed through some business model, usually a combination business model and new technologies, and everybody, or a lot of people, win. And in the case of capitalism, and really why 1994 began this other major trend, is you also have to make a lot of money at it. To be a successful disruptive leader, there's lots of money and high risk. And that's really, I think, why it took off, because now we've got, not for nothing that Jeff Bezos is the wealthiest man in the world.
Yeah.
Mark Zuckerberg became the youngest self-made billionaire ever. So these disruptors or disruptive leaders are creating companies, products, and experiences that have high value and help billions of people do something they weren't able to do before. And naturally, there's money attached to that and risk.
Yes, definitely. And then, again, interestingly enough, you'd think that a disruption would have to be a brand new idea, and it seldom is. It's usually an idea that already existed or something that was already, but there was a fault, and maybe whoever started it off didn't see that fault, didn't kind of know enough to kind of disrupt themselves, and somebody else steps in and disrupts. I mean, when you talk about Jeff Bezos, yeah, it seems like there was nothing else other than Amazon. Like he really did kind of do a one of a kind thing. But then Mark Zuckerberg, there was MySpace, and then from that came Facebook.
Right.
So, you know, very similar, but he still gets the credit for having the most successful one.
Yeah, and I always wonder. I mean, I write a lot about Jeff Bezos because he's sort of the poster child for this. Not only was he able to implement Clayton Christensen's ideas, but he's also able to talk about them very well. So I think I think Bezos was aware of the effect he would have. Zuckerberg's a little bit different. I'm not even sure he's a disruptor, although yes, he put MySpace out of business. He was really just a great innovator and saw something that could add value, and he had the wherewithal, and you know, but he's tough, aggressive, and a kind of take no prisoners attitude, was able to implement it. But Bezos was a real disruptor, as was Henry Ford. As was Michael Dell. Michael Dell disrupted the whole supply chain of computers by going direct and putting in the process lots of retailers out of business, but allowing consumers to have cheaper, better computers just in time, or as just in time as possible. So yeah, and in the case of Zuckerberg, I don't know, it was kind of a brand new idea, and actually he took it from just a basic idea that Facebook is the book you're given of people's pictures, their interests in freshman year, the first day of freshman year at Harvard. I went to Harvard, and so I remember Facebook. He literally just said, why don't we make this digital? I'm not even sure he was thinking necessarily of MySpace. I mean, he probably knew of it, but he was really just saying, let's put Facebook online. Oh, this works so well. Now let's start going to other universities, and it just snowballed. And again, I don't think he is that much of a disruptor. He really was an innovator, and it wasn't like I think it came fresh out of his head. In fact, there is this movie that says it came from the Winklevoss brothers. So disruptors do tend to steal ideas. And it's
but there's nothing wrong with that in business. I mean, it really, if nobody else is going to step in there and improve something, or make it more viable, more affordable, or more accessible, somebody does have to do it.
Yeah, and really disruptors, there's the old saying, it's not about the strategy, it's about the execution. These are great executors. So they may cobble together an idea, a new idea from a bunch of ideas already there. They may actually take an idea, but the fact that they can execute it, build an organization around it, global organizations, are really what single out disruptors from dreamers, if you will.
Right. And there was an interview that you had in your book where you had was mentioning an interview that was done, and it was about how, I think it was Bezos, that they had asked him like if he was worried about competition and this and that, and he said, no, I'm worried about the two guys in the garage, because it is amazing. It does seem like people stumble onto things because the computers that we have, the access that we have to the internet, it didn't exist when I was a kid, that's for sure. But now look what happens in people's garages, and from Steve Jobs to like everything. Netflix, the two gentlemen, they were in the car. They said they were just chit-chatting back and forth. I think they would carpool together, and they were chit-chatting back and forth about not being able to watch a movie when his daughter wanted to watch a movie, and boom, that blew up into Netflix, which is just an amazing, when you look at that process and you say, why am I not in those conversations?
Because we're not.
I know.
Reed Hastings is probably my other, if I can say it, favorite disruptive leader. And it's because he was able to master several forms of disruption. First one, he was the guy in the garage coming up with a great idea that put Blockbuster out of business and made, getting DVDs much more regulated in terms of it regular, more efficient, and so forth. But then he disrupted himself in his business by going into streaming, and he put that part of his business and made it bankrupt. It was actually a hard thing to do. It's not easy to suddenly put your core business out of business. But he did that successfully. And then he did another disruption when Netflix really was having problems and his business model was becoming obsolete and they were losing money, by going into content. And content is king. And he really gave, and he still is giving, the Hollywood studios a run for its money. Also opened the door for people like Amazon and others to enter the content business. So Reed Hastings is a pretty remarkable disruptor.
So, when we talk about these disruptors, is there a certain personality trait that you see that kind of runs through all of them? On your website, and this is for everybody listening, go to johnjfurth.com. And John has not only one of the best informative, gives it away for free websites that has so many resources to go to, it has an assessment that you can take to see what kind of a disruptor you are. And I thought that was just amazing because some of us don't really know where we fit in with that, if we even can get into that game, but that I think is a wonderful assessment. So the first question was, do you see some sort of personality trait that they all tend to have in common? Aggressive, I heard you say, go-getter, this, that. Like, is there something to that?
Well, I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about that. Now, you have to say I've met a couple of disruptors. Lou Gerstner was the master of internal disruption when he turned IBM around. I've talked to him. But some of these other guys I only know from reading and thinking. But when I look at the disruptors I interviewed, there is obviously some common traits that all leaders have. First of all, you got to be highly ambitious and pretty smart. Most leaders, even if they come under question for certain activities or decisions they make, they're still very smart, and they're obviously just have the basics of leadership. But yeah, they're very aggressive. They tend to be very good with conceptual ideas or concepts as opposed to something tangible. You have to be, well, another word is to say they're visionary, see something that's there that isn't there currently. And they tend to be kind of ruthless. They take no prisoners. I mean, you have to be comfortable with that when you're putting people out of business. They also trend, at least in the Silicon Valley, the technology side, a little bit on the intellectual side. And they can also look very laid back, but they're very intellectual. I mean, Bezos obviously is a great reader. Looking through his leadership team, I realized that and actually having interviewed for a role in his leadership development team, the first question was, what authors do you read? He obviously has a bunch of people who read and are therefore even more smart or smarter than those who don't, because they're coming across ideas and concepts every day through the act of reading.
That's an interesting interview question.
Excuse me?
That's an interesting interview question. I think I would be, that's not what you expect to hear. That's not the kind of question you expect. I'd be a little bit like, can I go think about this for a minute and come back?
Yeah, it's the interview question from hell. I definitely struggled with it. And of course, at that moment, nothing comes to mind. And of course, I didn't think my answer was anywhere near what it should have been. So yeah, that's the question from hell.
Yeah, that's when you leave that interview and then you're like, oh, I should have said this. That's what I would have done for the next 3 years. I would have been like, oh, why didn't I say that or this? And
yeah, it's also where your demeanor just drops because you're trying to think and still seem upbeat while you're thinking.
Especially when it starts like that. It's like, oh, now where are we going to go from here, But I took your assessment and I'm a learning disruptor. That tends to make me think that I really would not ever be a CEO, because if you said you have to be ruthless, and I've read in your book many instances where you were trying to coach a CEO and they didn't necessarily want to fire people that they needed to fire, or they didn't want to make the changes that they needed to because of they just didn't have that in them. They just weren't that killer instinct. That I could see myself not being good at that. But what is a learner? Give the different types of learners, or the different types of disruptors that could be coming out of that assessment.
Well, the learning one means, well, first of all, I always say there are 3 kinds of leaders. And I take a quote from Malvolio in 12th Night, not a play that a lot of businessmen know or have ever seen, but it's by Shakespeare. And he says, some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And you can say, if you substitute the word leadership or leader, you would see how it works. Some are natural leaders. The stars align right from the front, the beginning. Mark Zuckerberg being the perfect example, where he just right out of the gate, clearly knew how to make things happen. And then there's the bulk of us sort of in the middle, which is the learning disruptor, where we start traditional career, we don't start as a leader, and through learning and discipline and what have you, we rise up, and with the goal of becoming some sort of leader of usually of a business or something. Those who are thrust into greatness would be people like Gerald Ford, where he suddenly became president, and he wasn't really that prepared. Or Howard Stringer at Sony. Sony wasn't doing that great when he took over, but I knew Howard because I was at Sony at the time, and I actually sort of facilitated some of the transition. He just really wasn't even sure he wanted to be CEO, and that obviously showed. The stock plummeted 75%. So he had some, leadership thrust upon him. Although, and it's right, he was a very good leader before he took over Sony. It's just I don't think his heart was in it. So if we look at it that way, the learning disruptor is probably the bulk of it. Most people who take the assessment come out as that. But the other one is the idealistic leader, the one that's sort of more visionary, more marketing-oriented types that really look at the external market and really see what can we do to affect the market. There's the internal disruptor, like a Luke Gerstner, who is able to have the kahunas to really go in and change an entire company, and a huge one, 300,000 employees. That's the internal disruptor. And then there are sort of variations, the risk-averse disruptor, someone who really has to understand the risk or just does disruption because he's pushed to or she's pushed to it, and so forth. So the other ones are a little bit variations on those three basic archetypes.
Right. But even, to even get to the level that you said the Sony executive, he didn't really want to take over, Ford didn't really want to take over. They had to have some sort of motivation to get to even to the point where they're even considered for these positions. I mean, these are big positions, from President of the United States to being the CEO. And yet you stepped into that. And in 6 weeks, I want to say, you brought it back into being profitable with a team that you didn't even put together yourself.
It is the Association of Management Consulting Firms, which was a much smaller organization. But yeah, they were on the verge of bankrupt. And I had a great relationship with the chairman of the board, who basically hired me. She was an incoming chairman. And we really saw eye to eye. It was really one of those moments where there was no question what we had to do. It was a burning platform, which is one of the things, prerequisites that you need to affect change, because otherwise people don't buy it. They're not sure why. But that was the organization. Now, Sony, I came in to help with some of the headquarter problems reorganization, but that was a whale of a company that was beached. It's coming back now because they have a new leader who is probably the right leader for them.